Hey guys, welcome back to the Pauper Meta game. Today we're going to take some time to break down Masters 25. What did happen, what didn't happen, and, overall how the set is going to impact Pauper. Let's cut to the chase. It's not going to really have a huge impact on Pauper. One of the things that you have to keep in mind when you're looking at any new set that comes out, and granted the Masters sets tend to have a little more impact than a typical set, but overall, the thing you have to keep in mind is that Pauper is an eternal format. So every time a new set comes out, there's probably not going to be a whole lot of impact to Legacy. Even when you look at new sets coming out and their impact on Modern, usually is fairly small. Every once in a while, you'll have a set that will come out and will make an impact, but that's the exception and not the standard. Now, the Modern Master sets and the regular Master sets, there's some variables there that you have to take into account. Primarily, the fact that you're more likely to see a downshift in rarity of a card from rare or uncommon down to common in a master set. More of those usually come out in master sets than what you're typically going to see in a standard set, so people will get a little bit excited about that. But overall, I think you're probably better off to just temper your expectations and don't expect too much to change. The metagame evolves very slowly. Most sets have very little impact. Just real quick, I wanted to give a little example and demonstration of this. When you look at Is It Delver, this is a deck that's been around for a long time. Koldatha Boros has come and gone, but that's had more to do with the ban list than introduction of new cards. Tron's been around for a while, but even before Tron's basically doing the same thing that Cloud Post decks were doing before that. So the overall, deck concept and shell has been around forever. And the evolution was not because of new cards, it was again because of an update on the ban list. Mono Blue Delver, well, let me back up a little bit. Is It Delver hasn't been around forever. It's a fairly new innovation, but the innovation is just a twist on Mono Blue Delver, which has been around for a very long time. And the stuff that was tweaked to create Is It Delver was not based on new cards again, it was just a metagame reaction where some red was splashed. And I guess you could argue that the Ash Barons, allowed this deck to come into existence, but I would argue against that. You can actually run this just fine off of your slower tap lands. The Ash Barons are quite nice, but this deck really came about just as an interesting innovation and something where the pieces had been around and it was just a metagame thing that evolved. And it's basically just an evolution or an adaptation of Mono Blue Delver, which has been around forever. Blue-Black Control has been around since the dawn of Pauper. The particular cards have come and changed and gone. Same thing with Burn. Elves has been around forever. Affinity has been around forever. Boggles, the only thing, when you actually break down the Boggles deck list, yes, we have the cartouches that have come about now, so you'll tend to see some combination of those in the main and sideboard on Boggles. But Boggles has been around forever. Basically, all the pieces were in place in Boggles since Return to Ravnica, which has been a while at this point. So, Is It Blitz? Even, what's crazy? Some people may not realize that even before Temur Battle Rage, Is It Blitz was a deck that people still played. Ever since Dragon's Maze, when you got the Nivix Cyclops, and really even before that with Wii Dragonauts, believe it or not, this whole concept of running Killing Fiend and then a Nivix Cyclops, even without Temur Battle Rage, this is a deck that's been around. Obviously, it's better now with the inclusion of Temur Battle Rage, but you could always do things like pack a Fling in your deck or do some other crafty stuff. So, anyway, Stompy's been around freaking forever, since just about nearly the beginning of Pauper. And Mono Black Control was literally one of the first top decks of Pauper all the way back in 2009, and even before that, Mono Black's been around forever. So what I'm telling you is, when you really look at the top end of the metagame here, the new kid on the block is Mono White Heroic, and what's really interesting about Mono White Heroic is when you actually look at the cards that really make this deck tick. It was the Emerge Unscathed, I think, plus a little bit of a combination of the metagame evolving and getting to a place where this deck just kind of made sense. Because, well, and also Seeker of the Way. But I think Emerge Unscathed, because of the way this deck wants to play out, having the right protection cards in place. But yeah, this deck, definitely has some newer-ish cards in it. So the combination of these new cards coming about and the metagame being in the right place has allowed for a deck and cards that really hadn't seen play. Now, don't get me wrong, there's been a lot of white, mono-white decks throughout the history of Pauper. But these were, basically white weenie, white flying, some combination of tokens and aggro. And, having an actual heroic deck is not something we've seen until fairly recently, about the time Iconic Masters came online and gave the deck a few more pieces, and the metagame was in the right place for this deck to be good. Or at least good enough. So, anyway, the whole point of that little quick review is just to point out that, really, we're talking about slight tweaks. It's very rare for cards to come out that enable a deck to springboard from Tier 3 status up to Tier 1, or for a deck to go from non-existent to being a Tier 2 deck. This doesn't happen very often. With that in mind, Savannah Lions just doesn't, there's already, you can already find some good value creatures for 1 mana in white. I don't think Savannah Lions is going to do anything. I don't think White Weenie is good enough right now. Savannah Lions is okay, but it doesn't really have a home. Hordling Outburst is interesting because Goblins is kind of alright, but it's been not as good as the just mono red aggressive deck version that's been floating around. So it will be interesting to see if Hordling Outburst can turn the scales. The problem is your typical Goblins list doesn't want to run a ton of land, and getting to 3 mana, it's just tricky. The Goblins decks of old, have run very few, if any, 3 casting cost cards. And Goblin Matron is one of those cards that would be in that slot. So you'd have to ask yourself if you'd rather have Goblin Matron or Hordling Outburst, and you certainly would not want to do both. That would just be too many 3-drops for a land light deck. I think Hordling Outburst is interesting. It's also a card that's really interesting for something like Kuldotha Boros to consider, so it could cause that deck maybe to have some iteration and playtesting going back to its roots of actually being Kuldotha Boros instead of just white-red mid-range control. Pillage is an interesting card, but it's not really going to do a whole lot. It's, it'll go in some sideboards here and there because of the fact that you now can have a singular card that'll be good against Affinity and good against Tron, and that's not terrible. I don't know, I could see Kuldotha Boros actually, going in on some pillages. So I think there will be some more, iterations there that'll be interesting to watch. Maybe Izzet Delver, but again, 3 mana cost cards are something that Izzet Delver has to be very careful about. Because it's sideboard, it could probably get away with it. But I do think Kuldotha Boros is the most likely place to pick up Pillage. I don't think that Burn wants to be on it. So yeah, there's just, in terms of Tier 1 decks, maybe Izzet Blitz, maybe, but Izzet Blitz is trying to win. It's not trying to stop you, so I don't know. Pillage is another one of these cards that sounds great on paper, but I don't know how many homes it's going to have. I'd say Kuldotha Boros is a reasonable place that might pick up a copy or two. Frenzied Goblin is also an interesting addition to Goblins. It's really kind of lackluster, but it's better than some people might think. Being able to prevent your opponent from being able to block is actually really impactful with a deck like Goblins. And even though Hordling Outburst is really just a better card, in terms of its power level, the value, I guess I should say, I think Frenzied Goblin helps the actual Goblin game plan better. So I'd actually think that over the long run, if Goblins is going to creep up any in the meta, Frenzied Goblins is probably the more likely card to go in that list and actually do something. But right now, I don't know. I mean, Goblins is just in an awkward place right now because of things like Mono White Heroic being in the format, Boggles being in the format. Kuldotha Boros has a really good game against Goblins. Mono Blue and Izzet Delver both have a reasonable game against Goblins. So Goblins is just kind of in this funk right now, and I don't think these cards are going to be good enough to tip the scales. Cortisar is a card that's actually pretty sweet, but again, finding a home for this card, it might be a card that'll just kind of linger around in Pauper, and in a year or two, maybe the stuff will come together for white-blue to be a thing. There has been a white-blue deck, sort of a tempo-y white-blue deck that's been seeing some play. and it's all right, but it's not anything that's. I mean, it's not even showing up really as a tier 1 deck. I don't even know if it's tier 2. And Cortisar might go in there, but I do not think Cortisar is going to take that or any other deck up in the tier 1 status either. And there just aren't a ton of white-blue decks that the Cortisar could have a ton of impact in. However, the one interesting thing that we'll be curious to see is the Tireless Tribe combo deck. So, Tireless Tribe is a deck that is quite good. It does better than I think a lot of people realize. I do think it's a tier 1 deck, and maybe even one of the best decks in Pauper, even though, you know, it might not show up on MTG Goldfish as such. But right now the deck runs Augur of Bolos for 2 mana. The deck is very mana conscientious on casting costs. As you can see, the entire deck operates on a lot of cards that cost 2 mana or less. There is a circular logic in the list, but you know, 90% of the time that's getting chunked to a Tireless Tribe and they're actually only paying the 1 mana, or it's being played at such a late stage in the game that 3 mana doesn't really matter. So, you know, it's going to be interesting to see, because the Cortisar is definitely just, you know, overall better than Augur of Bolas if you ignore the casting cost, but you can't ignore casting cost. Being able to actually grab your Tireless Tribe with the Brainstorm effect is pretty sweet. So, yeah, so the Cortisar is, if it's going to fit anywhere immediately, it's probably Inside Out combo. I don't know if 3 mana is just too much, but I could see it fitting in the deck and actually, you know, being decent. But I mean, Inside Out is already a real deck. It's already performing well. I don't know how much this really changes anything in the meta really that much. Other than that, you know, there's that white-blue tempo deck, but I don't see the Cortisar doing much. Borrowing 100,000 Arrows is a very interesting card, just because, you know, being able to draw 3 or 4 cards off of 1 card, and you know, that's pretty interesting. But the problem is the kind of decks that would run, you know, borrowing 100,000 Arrows. You know, like, if you're being attacked by 3 or 4 creatures, you know, drawing a grip of cards is cool and all, but you're probably in a pretty questionable situation, because if you've got good blocks, well, then your opponent's not going to turn 3 or 4 creatures sideways against you. If they're only going to attack with 1 or 2 creatures, borrowing 100,000 Arrows is just so much worse than having a Ponder, a Brainstorm, you know, a Preordained. Pretty much anything else would be better. So you're only really getting good value on borrowing 100,000 Arrows if your opponent's just turning a lot of creatures sideways on you. But if your opponent's turning a lot of creatures sideways on you, that means you don't have good blocks, and you're probably about to die, and, you know, dying with a fistful of cards isn't going to do much for you. So this just seems a bit awkward. Jackal Pup, actually, of all these cards, even though not many people are talking about it, maybe the quickest card to have some kind of impact, although I don't think much. I think that the all-in, you know, sort of the evolution of Goblins, the all-in red deck, I think Jackal Pup fits in pretty nicely into that deck, because it doesn't really care about some self-inflicted damage. It's pretty okay with that, and it just does what the deck is trying to do. The deck doesn't really have doesn't have like really great 1-drops, so I could see Jackal Pup actually slotting in there pretty quickly. Haven't heard a lot of people talking about Jackal Pup, maybe because it just looks so bad as a card in today's day and age. But for Pauper, you know, it's more about what deck you can fit into to actually do something, more so than, you know, just raw power level. Crimson Mage is also kind of an interesting card that could go into the red deck, the aggro all-in red deck, but it's kind of a trade-off. I don't know. I don't think it's quite going to get there, just because paying 2 to drop it and then having to pay 1 to activate when you already have a lot of 2-drops in that deck that have haste anyway. So, you know, it's something to kind of keep an eye on, but again, I don't think it's doing much. Fencing Ace is alright, but I don't actually think this is doing much. I'm sure some people will probably experiment with it in their heroic deck, but I think the other options that are currently being run in that deck are probably about as good. I'm not going to say better. I mean, I could see a scenario where, I guess I should say, I can see an argument to be made where you could actually like slot some things around and make some adjustments. Dropping Seekers of the Way. And yeah, this is going to help you be more aggressive, but I mean, Seeker of the Way is also nice against other aggressive decks to give you that extra life gain, a consistent extra life gain option to win out. Helps against other aggro and tempo style decks. And it can be, you know, Seeker of the Way can also be a creature that's easier to protect just because putting a mutagenic growth on a Seeker makes it a 5/5, and this gets it out of the range of most burn effects, so that means your opponent has to have actual hard removal. So anyway, you know, you probably want to save your Emerge Unscathed for your heroic creatures as much as you can. So I don't know, I just think the way these pieces all fit together, I think Seeker of the Way is just fine in the deck. I think the double strike on the double strike on the Fencing Ace is basically overrated. I don't think it's really going to do a whole lot. You know, I'm sure there will be some 5/0 lists that are going to come out, and over the course of time there may be some number of these lists, but here's my prediction. Over the course of the next 6 months, when everything finally settles down, I would say at most you're going to see like half of the mono white heroics running Fencing Ace. I don't think you're going to see them entirely abandon Seeker of the Way. And that's at most. I think when people actually get done testing Fencing Ace, they're going to feel slightly underwhelmed overall by what it's doing. Anyway, honorable mention here, Ghost Ship is pretty interesting just because the body that's on it and the regeneration is hilarious, because having a flying regenerating creature in blue is just so weird. I don't I don't actually think this is going to be doing much in the meta, just because again it doesn't have a home. But if you actually can stick a Ghost Ship on the board, there's not a lot of things that actually kill it effectively if you've got the ability to keep the regeneration mana up, and it just blocks effectively so many things in the format. It's a little ridiculous actually. So I don't know, it's comedic. I mean, flying regenerators with nice defensive bodies. There's not a lot of that. It's certainly a unique addition to Pauper, but again, I don't think it really has any real home. I guess some people could tinker with it with you know, blue-black control shells or whatever as a sideboard card and mono blue, but this is just, Ghost Ship's just too dirtily. It's just so slow to get that online. But if you do, it'd be pretty cool, kind of as like a, you know, a rogue deck thing to tinker with. Loyal Sentry is also kind of cool. Maybe a sideboard situational card in certain places, but again, it's so easy to kill, and there are, I mean, Lightning Bolt is one of the most prevalent cards in Pauper. And even Gutshot. There's a lot of decks that are starting to pick up Gutshot that are not even in red. So, I mean, the stuff where Loyal Sentry would be the best is against other decks that don't traditionally have much in the way of removal, like going up against a mono white heroic or going up against Boggles. But, you know, for example, on the mono white heroic deck, all they have to do is, you know, give their creature protection from white, and then, you know, with the Chomano's Blessing, and then just bang right in and ignore the Loyal Sentry. So Loyal Sentry, again, I don't think has any great homes. It's so easily answered by so many different things. It's kind of cute, but it's a 1-drop that you know, like, but it's not an aggressive card. Like, you know, you want, the decks that are really looking for 1-drop creatures are aggro decks. Control decks are not looking necessarily for 1-drop creatures, because as a control deck, you drop your Loyal Sentry on turn 1, and then your opponent has plenty of time to plan around how to get around the Loyal Sentry and kill it. Or you just end up holding the Loyal Sentry for a long time, and you're not really getting that bang for your buck by being able to have a removal answer on turn 1. I don't know, it's just awkward. I mean, aggressive decks get the most bang for their buck out of 1-drop creatures. I'm not saying that control decks, like, I'm a big fan of Fume Spitter, and, you know, Loyal Sentry kind of falls in that territory, so I'm not saying it's terrible, but I think a lot of it is just that, you know, it's just an awkward card. It can't proactively kill your opponent's creature. It only kills your opponent's creature when your opponent decides to let Loyal Sentry kill their creature. So it just suffers from that awkward space of allowing your opponent to make a decision. Like, you know, a card like Browbeat, for example, this is a card where you play it and you can draw 3 cards unless your opponent decides to take 5 damage, which sounds good, right? Because it's like, well, either your opponent's going to take 5 damage or you're going to get 3 cards. The problem is, since your opponent gets to control the outcome, they can always make a decision that's the most optimal for them, and sometimes this means that Browbeat just doesn't do very much. They take 5 damage in situations where 5 damage doesn't mean anything, and they maybe let you draw cards when you're already dead anyway. And this is exactly the kind of problem with a card like Loyal Sentry, and it's also further compounded by it being in white, which some people might say, oh, this is great because white doesn't have as many good removal answers, so now they have another one. But it's going into a color that there's not a lot of powerful white-blue control out there right now. And even if at some point if there is, Loyal Sentry is just, again, just a very weird answer. You can do some tricksy stuff with it, you know, Loyal Sentry, block, blink it. But even then, again, you're setting yourself up to being open to getting blown out by removal unless you have a counterspell to even back that up. So I don't know. And then I want to mention Balduvian Horde because, you know, back in the day, way back in the day, Balduvian Horde was like one of the most powerful, incredible cards in the game, and now it's been downshifted. Not only has it been downshifted to common, but to add insult to injury to Balduvian Horde, it's probably not even going to see play in Pauper. It's the value here, 4 for 5/5, is where you got to discard a card. It's just not good enough. So this is pretty interesting times that we live in, where a Masters set will come out, downshift a bunch of stuff, and not really going to do a whole lot, frankly. Granted, you know, as I just explained earlier, I say we're in interesting times. This is basically how it always is with Pauper. You'll hear a lot of people talking about like, oh, these new Pauper cards, this and that, but basically calm everything down and don't buy too much into the hype. So anyway, I do want to take a minute to talk about what I think is more interesting. I'm sticking it here in the end for those faithful who are actually listening through to the bitter end of this particular episode, where I want to talk about the stuff that I think is more interesting, which is the reprints. So Nettle Sentinel, to me this was not very surprising. Nettle Sentinel has never been reprinted. The price was getting expensive. This is a card that gets played in both Modern and Legacy on occasion. See some fringe play. So, you know, that's something that makes a lot of sense. Ancient Stirrings definitely needed a reprint. Also, this is a card that sees play in Modern. I think it might even see some fringe play in Legacy as well. Not 100. That looks like mostly just Modern. But yeah, it's a card that sees some play in Pauper as well. Ash Barons I thought was actually a little bit surprising. I mean, it wasn't. I didn't think that they would reprint Ash Barons in a Master set. I expected them to throw this into another Commander set just as more value filler in a future Commander set. So I was kind of expecting Ash Barons basically in June or August of this year. I thought it was kind of interesting that they threw this into a Master set. No, it should be noted that this is an uncommon, but regardless of whether you're playing Pauper online and paper or both, I think you want to scoop these up now for this reason. The fact that Wizards printed this at uncommon signals that this is a card they're trying to preserve some value, probably so they can use it as a reprint down the road as well. This is not going to be like Evolving Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse, like a throwaway penny card or whatever. Ash Barons is a card that's going to continue to have value, so it could very easily be a couple of years before this card gets reprinted again. I think this is also a signal that they're really not intending to release Ash Barons in a standard set. I could be wrong on this stuff, but I think those are the signals. So if you've been unsure about Ash Barons, you just didn't want to spend that much on a land in Pauper, well, I would wait. If you want to get the absolute best value, wait until Masters 25 has been out for like a month or two, and then jump in there and grab your copies of Ash Barons, because it's probably not going to get any cheaper for a while. Utopia Sprawl, same story. By the way, this is true for any of these cards. I think these are all cards. If you want these for Pauper, then grab them after Masters 25 has been out long enough to reach peak supply. And then, you know, grab these things up, like, again, probably about a month or two. You just got to watch prices and see. Street Wraith and Simian Spirit Guide don't really have much impact on Pauper for the most part. Utopia Sprawl does, so if you've been wanting to build Boggles, it's a nice little thing to be able to pick up on the cheap now. So these are some nice cheap cards to pick up. Now, one of the things that's really, really interesting to talk about here is what's not included. So let's talk about the big cards that are not in Masters 25. Chainer's Edict is not included. And Chainer's Edict is going absolutely nuts right now. So right now, you know, pulling MTG Goldfish, it's we're looking at $11 in paper. And there's really no reason for this card to get any cheaper anytime soon. The next opportunity for this card to get reprinted is going to be, there's a couple of Commander products that are going to be coming out this year, one in June, one in August, I believe. And you know, there's probably a reasonable chance for Chainer's Edict to be included in one of those products. So if you're sitting on extra copies of Chainer's Edict, you know, I would say sometime in the next 30 to 60 days is probably a reasonable time to unload your Chainer's Edicts. The thing that's scary though is if you want to play a Pauper deck sometime this year where you really need these Chainer's Edicts, I don't think it's necessarily a guarantee that Chainer's Edict is going to be included in either of those Commander products. I think there's a pretty good chance, maybe, you know, maybe a 60% chance, but I really don't think it's a guarantee. Just because I really don't think the people at Wizards are, you know, in some back room going, wait, stop the presses, you know, we've got an uncommon that's gotten, you know, too expensive, let's hurry up and reprint it. Because, you know, if you even just looking at the Torment set, let's say that they wanted to add some value to a product. I mean, the crazy thing is Cabal Coffers is a $25 uncommon. And so, I mean, you know, Chainer's Edict also creeping up to $11. And, you know, so I mean, even within the set alone, Chainer's Edict is not the most expensive uncommon. And then, you know, so you've also got Circular Logic available as well as fodder. So, I don't know. It's weird. You know, Cabal Coffers is probably at a price point where if it gets reprinted, it'll be reprinted as a rare. What's really weird about Chainer's Edict is also, if it gets really expensive, would they opt to include it as a rare in some way instead of being uncommon? Probably not. But then again, I mean, Wizards seems to be somewhat value conscious. Like, they don't want to take a card that is typically worth like $15 and then crush its value to nothing. And it's not just because they're being nice and trying to look out for the value of people's collections. It's also because they realize they're not actually doing themselves any favors when they do that. Because if they just crush the value of cards like that, then they can't reprint them again in the future and have it be very enticing to players. So if you take a card like Chainer's Edict and make it a rare, and maybe the price goes down from $12 or $13 back to $5 or $6, well, now that's a card they can still reprint again in the future after it creeps back up to $10 again. So I don't know, but then again, Chainer's Edict is, you know, this is a kind of a weird kind of card to be at a rare. This type of effect is not something under the New World Order that we typically see at rare. So Chainer's Edict just occupies a pretty weird space. We'll just have to watch and see. I mean, I feel bad for you if you really need these and you don't have your copies yet, because it's kind of one of those things where you're just stuck between a rock and a hard place. Because if you pick these up now, there's a very reasonable chance you'll regret it, because they'll come out in a Commander product and the price will plunge down and you'll lose half your value on these. Or if you don't pick them up, there's a chance they don't get reprinted this year. You have to wait forever before you can get your copies, and the prices just keep climbing up. Because without a reprint, Chainer's Edict is going nowhere but north. So if you happen to be sitting on a bunch of copies, you know, if it was, you know, frankly, I think I've got a pretty decent stack of these. Not because I was trying to like pick them up for speculation. It's just I have a lot of blue-black Pauper decks. It's kind of ridiculous. And I may actually go ahead and just take a quarter or half of my Chainer's Edicts and just sell them now just to hedge my bets. And then I'll keep copies that I can still play with until it gets reprinted. But eventually it will get reprinted and the price will come down. Who knows how long. The other two cards that I think are worth mentioning are Tangle, which is a fog card out of Invasion, which also did not get reprinted. And these are the similar theme on these cards is these are the cards that are uncommon in paper but are common online, so they're legal in Pauper, at least currently the way things are being run. You'll also notice a similarity on the price charts of Chainer's Edict and Tangle, which is these are cards that were skyrocketing and then they started to nosedive. And you might be wondering, like, well, why is that? It's because people were selling out early because they were nervous that these cards were going to get reprinted in Masters 25 and the value is just going to get butchered. So people were bailing. And these prices are going to start coming back up now because these cards are not, haven't been reprinted. It's fairly similar to what you might see with cards that haven't been reprinted in Modern. Before a Modern Master set comes out, the cards might start to bleed down in value, but then when they don't get reprinted, they shoot back up. I could see the reactions in Pauper being a bit slower than Modern because Pauper's, definitely not where Modern is as a format. But these price trends are going to reverse now because people are going to need the cards to play with them, and it's going to be at least, until the summer now before the next shot at any of these cards being reprinted. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, there's actually quite a few of these cards, but the next card, the big three, Chainer's Edict, Tangle, and Battle Screech. So Battle Screech also, again, this funny to look at. You see this card plateauing at $7 and then kind of creeping back down to $6 and kind of holding steady. Now that there hasn't been a reprint on this, it would not, again, be unreasonable to expect the price to continue to trend upward. It's going to only go north up until we finally see a reprint. So same rules apply for Battle Screech and Tangle. If you have a lot of these, you might not want to sell out of all of them, but I'd probably get rid of like half just to hedge your bets. And then every 6 months that goes by, you're probably going to want to continue to sell copies off, just because the longer you go without a reprint, the more likely it is that you'll hit one. So yeah, this is kind of interesting. I also think this is really funny because you had all these people that were talking about, like, hey, if you buy Pauper cards, you're just throwing your money away because it's so easy for Wizards to reprint the cards. And I've been picking up a lot of copies of Crypt Rats because I knew that they would not be reprinted in Masters 25. I was right. I think they may still be holding steady at $3, and there is a chance these may actually get reprinted. The Crypt Rats have just kind of been holding steady around the $3 mark. I think that one of the interesting things about this price chart to look at on Crypt Rats is the fact that they've spiked up to about $3.50 and then leveled off at $3. If this was just one person going in and buying out all the copies, you'd see a much deeper retrace on this price, probably back down to around $1.50 or $2. What this tells you is generic demand, just slow creeping demand, finally hit this card to where it popped up. It wasn't just some random speculator. So this $3 price level is going to hold, and eventually we're going to see another breakthrough on the price of this card if it's not reprinted sometime soon. I think there's actually a reasonable chance the Crypt Rats doesn't see a reprint this year, but I would say it's more likely that something like Chainer's Edict will be included in one of the Commander products. There's some chance they would both be included, but I think if there's also a reasonable chance something like Chainer's Edict could get reprinted and we might not actually see a Crypt Rats reprint until something like next year. So at some point, WotC might, decide to do something silly and do like a Rats deck or something for Commander. I don't know. Anyway, I just think it's funny that I was able to pick these up for fairly cheap. I got my Chainer's Edicts around, between $2 and $3 each. I have quite a few. So all the people talking about how you'd lose all this money on Pauper, I wasn't even really trying to make money necessarily with Pauper. The only thing I really was intentionally specking on was Crypt Rats, and then I'm just picking up all this other stuff because I have so many Pauper decks. But now that these things are spiking so hard, I'll probably be able to sell, a chunk of these cards back that I have multiple playsets of, and basically have a free Pauper collection that just paid for itself. And then it's kind of hard to lose any money off of something that you basically got for free. So yeah, I think it's hilarious, all these commentators talking about, oh, don't buy into Pauper, you're throwing your money away. Like, well, I don't know, I kind of like having a lot of free decks to play Magic with. I don't really see that as throwing my money away, and it's hilarious because I wasn't even trying to make money. So yeah, best easy money format, I guess, for anybody who's going deep and actually buying a lot of staples over the last few months. It's payday. So anyway, thanks for checking us out this episode. Pauper is very legitimate. Do believe the hype. Masters 25 is not doing much, so don't believe the hype there. That's basically all I've got for today. So I'm gonna try to get something else out this week. Sorry I wasn't able to get to the Masters 25 breakdown before today. I've been really busy. A lot of real life stuff going on. So yeah. Anyway, I'll try to get something out later this week. Peace.